Right, so it's now becoming an almost daily matter of new scandals emerging for Keir Starmer's Labour right now, from security passes for glasses in relation to one Labour donor, to the Treasury recruiting a Rachel Reeves donor, to donations from the fossil fuel lobby just as energy bills rise. And here we have yet another one. Starmer's Labour is coming in for a lot of justifiable attacks right now in light of everything they're doing and more, with its polling nosediving over its mishandling and incompetence of some issues, not to mention political choices that are heaping out unnecessary cruelty as well. We've seen fallout come their way due to the riots, the stripping of the winter fuel allowance from 10 million pensioners, just before energy bills rose incidentally, which pointed out yet another broken Labour election promise to the nation, and of course donations have now been discovered in connection to that. There is the keeping of the two-child benefit cap, the migrant bashing and racist rhetoric. There is the obsequious creeping to the Israel lobby who have funded half of the Labour front bench. There's the refusal to ban arms sales, which has landed the government in court, though heavily delayed, because they've seemingly pushed rioters to the front of the legal queue. Well, that was awfully convenient, wasn't it? Very much a story I'm yet to cover, incidentally. But all of this, though, has contributed to dire approval ratings all inside 7 weeks. But a new angle has just been presented in regards to another horrible policy being put forward, namely the hike of social housing tenant rents to pay for more housing. But there's a scandalous new angle that has now been presented in regards to another horrible policy being put forward by Starmer's Labour, namely to hike the rents of social housing tenants to pay for more housing. But the angle to this story that you might have missed might actually have a much larger bearing on why Labour and Rachel Reeves are choosing to come after the poorest renters rather than the wealthy to pay for more housing, who so often happen to be landlords, of course. Right, so Labour's social housing policy. I went over this in a video the other day, spelling out the stupidity and short-sightedness of hiking social housing rents, which are typically around 40 to 50% of open market rate, in order to build more so-called affordable housing, which when the rental cost of that can be double that of social housing, around the 80 to 90% mark of open market rental rates, it's not necessarily very affordable at all. It's a really stupid thing to do. Levelling up, when the government talks about that, another chronically meaningless soundbite as that already is, but when they talk about it in terms of this, you don't mean levelling up the lowest rents to catch up with unaffordable, so-called affordable rates, and say we'll use that to build more unaffordable housing with. That'll free up the money to build more housing, says Reeves, whilst the reality will simply be that housing benefit rates go up. The housing benefit bill will have to rise to pay for Labour's stupid idea. But maybe there is a big fat ulterior motive for all of this that nobody has been talking about, and I have to address the elephant in the room here because it is absolutely scandalous. You see, when you think of housing benefit, a lot of people tend to think of this money being provided to people who, for whatever reason, cannot afford to pay their rents or all of their rents. Well, they might be disabled people and living in a house adapted for their needs. They may just be out of work. They may be in work but so low paid that the state has to pay their rent for them. That last reason, in my view, is a complete failure of government. Wages should, of course, pay enough to live on. That they don't is a situation that has been allowed to fester for too long. But equally, we can look at rent and rent caps and ask why they haven't been introduced, as rents become too high in comparison to wages, eat up into people's incomes too much, so much, and are on the other side of this societal problem when it comes to housing. It's all a matter of low wages and high rents for the most part. Wages must be brought up, and rents must be stopped from taking so much of a person's income. They can never save to buy. Their disposable income, which can be spent in the economy to benefit that, is instead sucked up by landlords who may not spend it at all. We know which side Keir Starmer is on in this, though, because the desire to bring in rent control has been floated by the, well, frankly, anything but left-wing Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, who has been pursuing this course of action for the City of London, which has by far the highest rates in the country, since 2019. And now a Labour government is here in power. You'd think this would be the time he gets told yes, but instead he's being told no again as well. There are no plans to allow rent controls to stop rental costs rising above what is reasonable, already above reasonable as they are for so many people. Khan's plan has been to set up a private rent commission, which would set the amount landlords could charge, and those landlords can either go along with that or they can sell up and free up more property on the housing market. And of course, the more housing there is available to buy, the more house prices would of course come down. That is the logic anyway. But Starmer has refused him, just as the Tories did before. Yet still, he's backing rent rises on the cheapest rental homes. Rents rising beyond what people can afford. Rents rising above a level where they can save. And if they're even worse off than that, then of course we all see more of our money, public money, being used to subsidise what is being charged for that housing by the people who own the housing, by the landlords, as the housing benefit bill is certain to rise. And it's a good point to bring housing benefit back into this conversation. Because as much as people might think it is a benefit for the worst off, it isn't, not really. It's handing over public money to their landlord for whatever they choose to set the rent of that property at, and as long as it is below the benefit cap still, the monthly rent will be paid in full out of that. If it rises above the benefit cap, the tenant still has to find some of the money, even as the landlord potentially maxes out what they can milk from the state. Housing benefit never goes to the tenant. It always goes to the landlord. The housing element of universal credit, many claimants of which of course will be in work, does get paid to the tenant, though they can choose it not to be the case if they choose that. If the housing benefit bill rises, though, it is to supplement landlords. That is the crux of it. That is what everybody needs to understand. Housing benefit goes to landlords. It's money for them. It is in the national interest to keep that low, to get that number down. It's already too high. Instead, it's going to go up even higher under these plans by Starmer of Reeves. To not let tenants get fleeced, essentially, is what it's in the interests of. But Labour has a problem with this, because like most parties, it's riddled with landlords. But now in this Parliament, 3 of the 5 biggest landlords are now Labour MPs. And in fact, the biggest landlord in the House of Commons today is a big scandal in and of itself, a scandal within a scandal, if you like, that goes to the very root of what the Labour Party even stands for anymore. The Labour Party was, of course, born out of the trade union movement. It was created by the trade unions for working class people to represent them. So can you imagine the scandal there would be if, just for example, Labour ditched a trade unionist in favour of installing the biggest landlord in Parliament to replace him? Because that is exactly what has happened. You might recall the former Labour MP for Ilford South, Sam Tarry. Tarry came into Parliament from the TSSA Transport Union and got himself sacked from the front bench by Starmer for doing what every Labour MP should do when ordinary working class people are taking industrial action and joining them on the picket line. Since becoming Labour leader, Starmer developed a sudden and very hardline allergy to standing by working class people taking such action and forbade his ministers from doing likewise. Tarry, being a trade unionist, defied this, and off to the backbenches he was sent. But then Tarry also fell afoul of Starmer's ire for the crime of being seen as a lefty in his party. He fell afoul of being replaced by a more Starmery sort, shall we say. And this, of course, meant he had to go, and thanks to a concerted Labour right effort in Ilford South and allegations that the dodgy and honour-voter vote in question was fiddled, Tarry ended up deselected as the Labour candidate in favour of Redbridge Council leader and right-winger Jazz Athwal. Jazz Athwal was, of course, then duly elected in the general election landslide for Labour and is now not only the Labour MP for Ilford South, but is the biggest landlord in Parliament, bar none. And there's no running away from that because it's all there in the Register of Financial Interests. According to the Register, Athwal owns 18 rental properties, of which all but 3 are residential. So that's quite the portfolio he's got there, and quite the interest in not seeing rent controls come in, you would imagine. The other 2 Labour MPs in the top 5 of MP landlords are also brand new intake Labour MPs. So Starmer clearly has no qualms about landlordism within his ranks, and what that means for tenants in this country, given that they are now the lawmakers on such matters. And in fact, one of those new MPs is one of those who effectively awarded themselves a safe seat, having been on the Labour National Executive Committee beforehand. A right-wing sidekick of Luke Akehurst, Gurinder Singh Josen, now MP for Smethwick. He owns 8 rental properties. And the other is the new MP for Southend East, Bayo Alaba, who owns 7 properties. The other 2 in the top 5 are apparently Tories. I must admit I haven't done the legwork on this searching the register. The Financial Times did, and they helpfully didn't name both of the Tories. But one of them, to no surprise to anybody, is Jeremy Hunt with 9 properties. But here's the thing though, even though these numbers are probably an underestimate, it'll be no surprise that there are 85 MPs identified as landlords in the register, with 44 of them being Labour, 28 Tories and 8 Lib Dems. But this could be an underestimate, because under the definition of what needs to be declared, an MP only needs to declare a rental property in the register if they make more than £10,000 a year off of it in rent, or £830 a month. If it's below that, and that is possible in some parts of the country still, then it won't be in the register. Fundamentally, though, the more landlords there are in Parliament, the more opposition there will be towards pro-tenant legislation. Even an ardent Tory like Michael Gove accused landlord MPs, when the Tories were in power, of scuppering reform to the housing market previously, voting in their self-interests, and now there's even more of them. If social housing rents are being driven up to pay for more housing, that potentially allows the rents of other housing to rise too, and any attempts to mitigate that with legislation could be obstructed by MPs who have a vested interest in blocking such measures. You drive up rents at the bottom of the market, the rest of the market will just get pushed up as well. You end up with more people unable to pay. Housing benefit, which just goes to landlords, will go up too. So we're all paying more for their greed, in essence, at the end of the day. Another way of looking at this is that social housing providers are councils and housing associations, not private landlords. But by driving up their rents, they are giving private landlords a free pass, and of course they'd be fine with those rents being driven up because of the aforementioned reason. It benefits them as well. And also people who are waiting a long time on the housing lists for a council property or a housing association property, if the rents are driven up more in line with more mainstream, affordable or open market rents, they're less likely to just hang around on that list and just go private at the end of the day anyway. Even more incentive for landlord MPs and landlords in this country as a whole to just keep on providing more and more property and buy it up as it becomes available. Where a source of income to build more housing might have been identified here, that might play well to some people. Ultimately, it will cost us all more in housing benefit at the end of the day. And who will build these new houses as well? Affordable housing doesn't necessarily become council or housing association property. It genuinely depends who's actually building a given development. If it's a private development being built by whoever of a certain size, they have to provide a certain amount of affordable housing by law. But then who buys it if it's unaffordable? How many of those properties end up as buy-to-lets? There's so many holes in this Labour policy, and given the number of landlords in their ranks now, the optics are scandalous that this is landlord-centric housing policy being made, and not actually in the national interest at all, and certainly not saving money. I covered more of Labour's plans to hike the rent of social housing tenants and how social housing might actually be wiped out as a thing in this video recommendation here. A different slant, a different way of looking at this. The party that actually created social housing now potentially being the party about to destroy it completely as your next watch. So if you're so inclined, then I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.